Maybe I can set a little bit of context about like how I come into this conversation, and we can take
Fantastic.
it from there. So
Great.
I've been working in decentralized organizations for about 10 years, and I have basically ignored DAOs, as in decentralized organizations in crypto space. I've only like had these brief sort of encounters and seen them from the outside. And honestly, I've been quite dismissive. It's like, oh, it seems like a bunch of people playing with money and speculation. And I don't know, I just didn't see anything there that I recognized. I sort of saw like, like for example, this real well, as an outsider with not much context, I wasn't really distinguishing DAOs from the rest of the crypto scene. It was all just like one big amorphous world that I don't really understand. And that it seemed like so much of when people were coming to questions about coordination and cooperation, it seemed to always be in the context of very large scale, therefore very inhumane, completely mechanistic with a design for zero trust systems. And I was just like, oh, that kind of gives me the creeps. Plus the whole money speculation, gold rush thing was like, oh, this doesn't feel like me. And I just kind of ignored it. And then, yeah, I guess just in the last 6 months or so, I have this kind of obsessive brain that just hooks onto a thing and goes and jumps down the rabbit hole. And so like 6 months ago, I started jumping down the general crypto rabbit hole and DeFi and trying to understand all this stuff, which had been completely foreign to me. And now I'm like clicked onto, okay, there's the subset of the crypto world around DAOs where people are actually trying to organize at a smaller scale. And then I heard a podcast a couple of days ago with Tracheopteryx, your co-founder, I think, and hearing about this context of like, what happens when we treat trust as a feature, not a bug, and start to that conversation, that podcast was about compensation systems. But I'm sure there's other, that immediately starts touching on like roles and responsibilities and accountability and all that sort of stuff. And that's like, okay, this is my jam. Like, how do we do small scale, high trust coordination where we're organizing in terms of partnership instead of domination? And to hear on this podcast stuff like talking about adult development and reinventing organizations and this kind of frame of reference was just like, I found one. Okay. So now I wanted to connect and get your story, understand what you're up to. What's the sort of state of the art? Is it something that I can start picking up and recommending to my peers, or is it still too bleeding edge? All of that sort of stuff. So that was kind of my launching point.
Awesome. Wow. It really mirrors a lot of my own experience of spending, depending on when you count, but about the last 10 years working on networks, impact networks, convening people to create communities for impact and social and environmental issues through my consultancy Converge. And the same, like, I guess it was a little bit longer, but like 10 months ago, someone wanted to get me involved in this DeFi project and sort of fell down the rabbit hole and just started tumbling and also felt the same, like, oh, it's a casino basically, right now, at least at this stage. But there was something there that was interesting in the way that these organizations were forming, and I think a lot of my early exposure was to Yearn, because I was friends with Tracheopteryx in a previous life. And so as Trach was sort of getting, and we had geeked out on all things, teal and adult development and network before. So he was like, you gotta come check this out. And so seeing the way that Yearn was working, I was like, oh, so there's something here in terms of this ways of collaboration. And then the deeper I've gone and found, there is this subset of folks in the DAO space that are certainly concerned with the bigger question of like, how I would frame it, and trying to find more people who would frame it this way. But like, how are we actually going to coordinate our way through the teeth of the Anthropocene that we are both in and increasingly going to be deeper in? And as someone who's been in the sustainability field for my whole career and started working with corporations and trying to sort of, change from the inside, I've sort of, haven't had a lot of hope recently, having worked with them and just say like, oh, there's nothing that can really stop this, this engine. And DAOs are the first time of like, oh, there is potential to coordinate at scale. And so, it was Trake and I and another co-founder, Zem, started Coordinape, which is sort of just a little tool to help in that process, but really also connecting a lot more to these DAO leaders and trying to find those folks who are like, yeah, coordination for what? And all of these DAOs right now, I think it's fair to say they're all prototypes to figure out how can we actually make these systems and structures work. And so, I'm fairly, depending on how you measure, like the OGs are 2017, in the space. And so, I'm really new, but I'm definitely, this is where I'm spending kind of all my time and energy right now, and bringing that lens of having been a practitioner of networks for the last 10 years. So there's definitely something here that's definitely bleeding edge. And I think what's happening here is also like really important for change makers, or however you want to kind of define our world, to really tune into.
Maybe I can share as well. I guess I've got a very implicit kind of theory of change. That like, I came into this world through when we started Lumio, which again is kind of like a pre-blockchain DAO in the sense of like, both it's built by a cooperative and it's trying to enable people to make cooperative decisions.
Right.
And I say it's an implicit theory because I don't have a formal theory that I'm working through. I do navigate by some kind of internal intuitive compass, and that compass like directed me away from software. Like the more that I got into the challenge of, let's say you've got 50 people they're all good faith actors. They've all got high trust. They've all got some shared commitment to a constructive outcome. At first it was, what's the software tooling that we can use to support them? And obviously there's opportunities there. There's like a million opportunities to remove friction. But I kept coming up against this challenge that like when someone downloads a piece of software, they expect it to solve their problems. And within those contexts that I'm describing, the governance problems are not actually legible to the software. Like the governance problems are stemming, I think, from like an embodied lack of trust, that something in my guts feels uneasy when I'm around you, and therefore I'm going to second guess every proposal that you put forward until there's something, that subconscious something in my guts decides like, actually, no, I trust Zach. We've established some kind of bond, and I have this image in my head that you've basically got my best interest at heart. And so long as that trust is there, I'm going to basically delegate votes to you. I'm going to be very comfortable with like whatever you do. I'm not going to second guess every decision that you make. And there are all these like very subtle dynamics of interpersonal relationship stuff. Like that's where the challenge of governance is happening at a small scale. And I just don't imagine that's ever going to be read particularly well by software. And so my interest got more and more and more into like, well, that seems to be where the action is. It's just not a domain that software is relevant. And so where I've kind of concluded now, like, and I expect this will keep changing. This is not a set in stone thing, but now most of my energy is going into this microsolidarity framework, which is like a methodology for building a particular kind of community, which is preparing people to be working together in a spirit of partnership without domination hierarchies, because that seems to be the necessary precondition before they're going to have a good time cooperating without a boss. So I guess I want to stress test that hypothesis a little bit with you, and because you're currently in the phase of like, okay, well, we're going to hack on this technology solution, and I'm wondering if I'm kind of flirting with the idea, like, am I being called back into it?
So I would say, well, I'm the wrong person to stress test that theory with, because I'm 100% on board with it. Like, trust is by far the most efficient coordination mechanism there is. And, moving at the speed of trust. And that was kind of the cornerstone of all of our work in building impact networks. And I think you're really hitting on something something that in the crypto world I've seen, it is sort of like, well, DAO tooling, like everyone's excited about DAO tooling and what are the tools that we need, as if there's going to be some software suite that will correct for someone reading a text wrong, or someone overreacting in defense of perceived someone else, all these social layer things that, especially in real life, are actually much easier to sort of process in real time. But the fact that Web3 happens in this asynchronous communication, without tone of voice, without facial expression, without all these things, that sort of allows people to build rapport. I've been thinking a lot about when people talk about DAO tooling, having some tools for social layer stuff. What are all of the different exercises that we have, for building connection, and how do those need to be adjusted for folks that are anonymous? We did a lot of stuff with true stories and life stories, and that isn't applicable a lot of time in this space. But so I think we're in total agreement that like the software is necessary but wholly insufficient. So we're hitting on a software tool because it does a specific thing well, but the most important thing, which some folks are calling layer 0 or the social layer, but essentially like the human layer, what is the tooling for that, I think is something that folks like yourself have a huge amount of value to add to the space. When we talk about DAO onboarding is a big conversation, and I think offboarding needs to be a much bigger conversation. But people talk about sort of getting people the context and the information, and it's all very cerebral. And to your point, like, the whole of Web3 kind of happens from the neck up right now. And part of that is just because of the medium, but finding ways to get the heart and gut more involved, I think is going to be critical if it's going to be what we think and hope it could and should be.
Yeah, I guess one of the big puzzles for me, there's a few, my brain is going on multiple tracks, right? So there's the layer 0 thing, the social layer. First off, is it even possible to turn culture into a template? And obviously it's possible. I think that's what colonization is. It's like the rubber stamp going clonk, 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 you will all be the same.
Yeah.
But is it possible to do that in a way that enhances life, and responds to different contexts and works for lots of different kinds of people and doesn't just produce the sameness? That's like a really crucial, that's the kind of problem that keeps me up at night, because it's like, I know that I am capable of designing cultural memes that shift the way that people encounter each other. I don't think I'm not quite ready to claim that I can start a religion, but it's kind of heading in that direction of when I say a cultural meme, it's like people forming new kinds of institutions, new kind of chosen family, new kind of economic arrangements. That's what me and my peers are up to. And I'm really concerned that what we bake into that has kind of like the minimum viable consensus ingredients that we leave it as liberal as possible for as many different kinds of expressions to come into it, and just have the minimum set of boundaries that say, like, these things we just can't support, but everything else, go for gold, do what you like. That's so there's that whole question of, like, is it even possible to scale that kind of culture in a way that is life enhancing? And then the second challenge is the technology side is like just the sheer complexity of what we're dealing with. Like what I heard about how Coordinape works, it reminds me a lot of the experiments we've done in Spiral, especially in the earlier days where we were more rapid iterating experimentations with compensation and stuff like that. And I still feel to this day, after 10 years of experimentation, we never did anything better than a spreadsheet and a good facilitator. And it's the good facilitator that's the ingredient. It's about, like, how do you coordinate people's attention in an efficient way so that they all pay attention, they do their thing, and then they distribute and get on with their thing again. Like, that's the hard part. Yeah, so it's just like the size of these challenges.
Well, yeah. In some ways, DAOs are kind of just the next, an iteration of what y'all were up to it in Spiral, and several other. There's sort of that's that's one of the things I've been thinking about is a lot of, like DAOs are the new exciting thing. And we forget like this, people have been organizing in groups, trying to do things in a non-pyramid way for many, many decades and calling it all sorts of different things. What are the lessons we can learn from them? I think the difference is the reason I'm excited about DAOs and Web3 is we kind of have new infrastructure and new rails to build this stuff on, right? Through tokenization and through immutable contracts. To your first point about culture, I mean, my hope is, of course, we can't templatize culture, but we can create deliberate process for emergent outcomes. So, for example, like for any DAO, like you can have whatever principles and purpose you want, but here's a process, like you need to have purpose and principles if you want this thing to last. And so there's sort of building blocks like that I think we can add. It's like you're going to need to have relationality among people. How you want it is, totally up to you. But here's some different ways to explore what kind of relationality you want to have. We know from practice and from the research that just like trust is the single biggest predicting factor of success in a collaboration. So it's like you're going to need trust, and what kind and how you build it is totally up to you. Here's a menu of options. So I think there's a way to point at the pieces that are important without saying like you need to have a culture that values biomimicry as a way to understand how, obviously. And then the second point, like, yeah, it's sort of like a great facilitator is worth 10,000 hours of rigmarole. And that's something I'm really interested in, is this role of what is the CEO of a DAO? We don't even have language for it yet, but it's the coordination function. We call it network coordination or air traffic control, I think is sometimes a good metaphor, but it's like who's putting people in context, who's framing things, and who's doing the weaving of the network, sort of making sure information and connection goes to the right places and trust is getting built. And I think that's a skill set that folks, like at the Hum, you're basically training that. And it's desperately needed right now with these DAOs that are forming, and people are flooding in. They get the essence, they get the vibe, and they're like, yeah, this is what I want to do. How do I help? What do I do? And it's, it's a bit of a delightful shit show in Discord with like a bunch of people running around knocking into each other. And there's obviously, varying degrees of sophistication in people that are solving this. But I think there's that facilitation role is one that can be learned. There's obviously innate talent, but it also can be learned. And I think that's a huge gap waiting to be filled. As well, like DAO leadership. And even that word is kind of, it's like we don't quite have the language yet. I think that's another thing I'm really excited about as we embark on this field building, is like getting some common language and lexicon together. For what are we calling these things? Community manager seems to be kind of sticking, and I'm like, oh no, like who wants to manage a community?
Well, who wants to be managed?
So, right, exactly. It's like that's not why I'm in a community, in order to be managed. But like, obviously, the concept is really clear. It's just the language isn't right. So that's something that also. It is like it's a weird mix of super early days in these DAO things, and also we're just kind of reinventing the wheel with better materials from all of the co-ops and experiments that have come before. That's sort of that's my experience, and the ability to be really global. And one thing that I think a lot about, and I'm increasingly thinking a lot about, is what is going to be. I think that any DAO that's going to be around for a period of time is going to settle into some sort of cadence of, deep dive, retreat, or in real life experience for X amount of days, and then go back to work. And I could see definitely like twice a year for a week, everyone descends someplace and really, supercharges, lays the ground, has the hard conversations, and then goes back. Um, I think if that's a pattern we don't see, I don't think DAOs are really gonna find their full fruition.
I completely agree. I mean, at least once a year. Twice seems to me, for me, like twice feels like a healthy heartbeat, and once is like a minimum, a minimum to keep the organism alive. Like
right.
the embodied gut level trust thing, I think, is so essential to like you mentioned offboarding, for example, like such a difficult decision to ask someone to leave or to forcibly remove them. You need to have each other's back when you're going to make a decision like that. And I honestly don't know if we can get that level of trust without sharing a meal together, like that mammal layer of like, I'm eating, you're eating, we're vulnerable and we're safe at the same time. Like that does something to you.
Right.
Like I keep repeating, like we're social before we're rational. There is a little ape in us first, and that ape has needs dealt with.
Yeah. Our whole theory and brand is that it's more than a little ape, sure.
Yeah.
So and to me, like that's also the other side of that coin. Is it's really exciting seeing what some of these DAOs have accomplished, with just kind of asynchronous coordination across the globe. And crypto obviously has deep roots in like computer science, technology, engineering, coding, which lends itself well to collaborating on a specific endpoint, a deliberate process and a deliberate outcome. But now as DAOs are forming that are trying to have emergent outcomes, that social layer becomes even more critical. And so and I also think, just due to the nature of sort of programmers, obviously trading in big stereotypes around being more introverted or more focused on individual work, I think there's probably a massive underestimation of the power of being together in person. Having a few conversations with different DAOs, they're sort of like, why?
Yeah.
And then, my theory is it would only take once for them to be like, oh,
yeah,
wow, we thought we were powerful before.
Yeah, we hosted a retreat. Well, I was just invited to contribute. I wasn't the host, but to support a retreat it was basically like an open source software project, and they got a grant. And so that it meant that they could pay for a bunch of developers to come together for 10 days in this forest, like really sweet offer, come on, hang out. And they were smart enough to match, like for every developer, we're going to have someone who's a non-technical person who's also going to participate in different ways. I think basically just to make sure there was a good like social atmosphere, that there was going to be people that were more oriented towards connection rather than just like hacking on code. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that emerged in that process, because we brought the kind of stuff that we do at Inspiral, which is like inviting a kind of intimacy and authentic connection. And one of the things that came up from the developers was this shared, they started to name this thing that they'd never put their finger on before, about how the way that I remember it anyway was like that there's something about programming where the human is being programmed by the computer. Like to be a successful programmer, you have to enter into this state of deep concentration and abstraction, and to come out of that at the end of the day and then to connect with someone. Actually, there's like a huge refractory period where I'm not really available to be dealing with mushy, ambiguous, complex humans. I'm in this like really programmatic mode. And it was this kind of like shared, almost like a grief of like, actually, it feels like it's shaping my brain to be less and less available for human connection. And I hate it. that was kind of the emergent theme there. And I wonder if that was just like a random one-off thing with this particular group of devs, or if actually there is a challenge there, or an opportunity there, that like, maybe there are ways to have really high quality relationships and have a genuine sense of belonging, and like you're connected and you're still a great coder. You can flick, effortlessly between those two spaces. I wonder if that's an opportunity.
I mean, it's certainly an opportunity. It makes a lot of intuitive sense. That's not a conversation I've had with a lot of developers. but it's probably because, you know, it's not one that I've had the spaces to open, because again, like it's really hard on a Discord to start talking about your internal experience. You know, it's again, like the mediums don't lend themselves well to the real intimacy and connection side of things.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think, you know, opening that invitation out to a larger community, you might really find some resonance. That might be a bat signal that gathers a lot of folks.
And I guess I'm also thinking about the related problem, which is like, well, not problem, but the factor of it's not just that it's asynchronous, it's also pseudonymous. And if trust is the determining factor of high performance teams, like what is trust in the context where people don't actually know who the other person is? Like if they're lacking some dimensionality of who their identity is, like, is it possible to, if you don't know, like, you know, something about this person's family of origin, or like their heritage, or like some of these, you know, what they like for breakfast, if you don't know some of these key ingredients of a person, is it possible, or does that create a foundational kind of like a limit that's insurmountable? That there's always going to be a competitive advantage for the people who know about each other's breakfasts.
Yeah, I think it you know, it really depends on what types of collaboration we're talking about. I have to say that like my theory coming into crypto is that those are absolutely required. You know, if I don't have a sense of who you are and what you care about and how your worldview is shaped, I'm not going to be able to completely trust you. And that's true to some degree, but if what we're trying to do is, you know, build this piece of software, you know, or make this code right, or collaborate on this article, when there's a deliberate outcome that we're collaborating on, your competence becomes much more important than our connection. And so, you know, you can learn a lot about someone from working together. You know, we always, our sort of theory was like, you can't really develop trust without connection. So I need to understand, you know, who you are and what you care about, but that's insufficient too. Like if we just have connection and I don't experience your competence and we aren't actually building something together, then I also really can't trust you. You know, I need to have both of those. And so it seems like crypto tends to be a real high competence trust environment. And I guess that's sort of one of the theses that I'm working on is that we could really supercharge that with more connection. And you know, I'm very curious, like when we have that, you know, what will some of these DAOs turn into, especially the more, you know, the protocol DAOs that are already like well established and chugging along in DeFi world. But they're largely organized around these deliberate outcomes. You know, whether they have their metrics, just like any other organization. And so, but they may not have been together. You know, what does trust building look like if I don't want you to know anything about my quote unquote personal life? You know, that to me is a real interesting design challenge, and one that I get excited about like, how can I elicit people's worldview and understand things without kind of digging into their internal depths.
That's a really interesting challenge.
But I think that, again, going back to like this IRL component, I think that a lot of people that are pseudonymous and really wary of doxing, when they get into that more trustful environment of a team, I mean, it's my theory that everyone is longing for, you know, for belonging. And that seeing and being seen is actually the real base of Maslow's pyramid. That, you know, that's what fulfills people most, is when they have a chance to really appreciate other people's gifts and give their own and get appreciated for it. And so creating ways to do that, I think it'll surprise people. You know, I've seen this countless times where it's like, I'm an introvert, I'm not into this kumbaya bullshit. And then they find out that they actually are, and that it's not kumbaya bullshit. It's just being being human social creatures together. And so I think we'll see a big uptake of this. You know, if before we kind of were like 90% in an office and 10% working remotely, I think that's going to flip, and, you know, sort of having 5% time together in person and the rest of the time distributed will become the norm, you know, in the long term for everyone, and for DAOs especially sooner.
I guess I've got a hypothesis which will be proven out over the next couple of years. My hypothesis is that, yes, you can have this kind of limited trust, pseudonymous collaboration, but that if you're really trying to do something ongoingly innovative and dealing with complex changes in the environment, you're gonna be outcompeted by people that know each other, that really know each other and are doing this, like, they have a higher degree of contact with each other. We'll see if that works or not, but that's my guess. I'm thinking as well about
it kind of, just on that point, like, you know, there's decades of management and leadership science that would totally back that hypothesis, and that have proved out, you know, because trust, a lot of times people think of, and I think you went to this point earlier, of when I trust someone, you know, I'm more likely to delegate my vote to them, or agree with them, or you know, be simpatico. But really, where trust gets its value is when you hit the conflict, you know, and if I trust you, I'm going to have a much more generous interpretation of a bullshit tweet you made, or, you know, when you're wrong and then you say you're wrong, you know, that's going to build a lot more trust. Like when it's the conflict where trust is valuable. It's not when in the swimming stage.
I'm laughing because I had this scenario today with a friend of mine on Twitter. He's in New Zealand, so we're at the opposite end of time zones, and I thought he was writing some bullshit tweets. He thought I was writing some bullshit tweets, but I've seen him cry, he's seen me cry, you know, like, we've seen each other, we've shared some of our most vulnerable parts with each other and held them with integrity. And therefore, it's like, you just come at that conflict in a really different way. It's like, I'm going, instead of like, oh, this asshole, what an asshole, I need to tell him how wrong he is, this jerk. It's like, wow, I'm really surprised. I'm hurt that he feels so differently about this than I do. And I'm surprised, and I'm just like trying to model what is going on for him. Why does he think this way? What am I missing, you know? And then some other people showed up and like helped us see a different way. And it's like, the problem gets solved. It's like, oh, okay. This makes sense now. I just need, my model of him was kind of out of date and needs to be brought back up to speed. It's like such a different experience from some random anon who we have no mutual investment in each other's well-being. It's like, that's a bullshit tweet, and I will tell you your bullshit, go away.
Right. That trust makes you introspect first. You're like, well, I trust him, so what's going on in me? As opposed to like, I don't know this person, like, what's going on with you?
Let me show you how you're wrong. Hey, I had a thought just before. You've mentioned a couple of times about, you know, this idea of people temporarily coming together once or twice a year for a week or something. And I'm completely there with you, like that. All of the best teams that I know do that. If they're not permanently together, they're doing it periodically. And I have a hypothesis that there's another pattern, which is like, so in the Microsolidarity framework, it's sort of like, I call that a congregation. It's like you're congregating, you're coming together. And then in the rest of the year, your main point of focus is a crew. And so that's like 3 or 4 or 5 people. And you have a similar degree of depth and connection and intimacy in that crew or team, you know, a squad or whatever. But you're not having to track so many different characters. It's just like, okay, we might have a call once a week or something like that. Or maybe it's just a Discord, but there's within that very tight, very high boundary trust layer, you have that same, you're still in touch with that sense of like, that culture, that like what it means to be usness is still there. And then you kind of go and get refreshed at the next congregation and like bounce into and make new crewmates and have new opportunities and exchange lessons and that sort of thing. So I wonder if you're seeing evidence of that.
I am, and you know, I like, for example, Orca Protocol, I know is trying to build a sort of a DAO stand-up system all organized around pods. That's, you know, very similar to that idea. And I've looked at sort of I think of it as the hum framework. Maybe that's not right, but yeah, this sort of like the way that you break down little Dunbar squads in terms of, you know, the congregation, the squad, and then I think there's even one underneath that. But I mean, one of the questions that brings up for me is, you know, you're always going to have teams that you're working with on some sort of, you know, different project teams within a DAO, assuming you're trying to get something done, right? So there might be this marketing and messaging group, there's the dev group, whatever. And are those squads? Or I guess I could see one model where those are squads and there's some sort of culture pulse that goes out that says like, hey, at this week's squad meeting, like, here's a prompt if it's interesting, right? Yeah. Or here's a share, like something to sort of keep that layer 0 signal going. And then it's also like, is there value in having these cross-pollinated squads where it's like the whole point of the squad is just the culture piece?
Yeah.
What I've seen is that's a good idea in practice, but it's just really hard to make time for things that are just culture. You know, eventually that call is going to be the one that gets dropped because we're just getting together and sharing our humanness, but we all have tons of shit to do, and we also have this whole world outside the screen where also is competing for our humanness. Yeah, you know. And so I think weaving that in somehow, but again, like, this is why that congregation is such a critical component, because you know, from my experience of doing these networks and convenings, you can't really build that kind of intimacy online, but you can maintain it. Yeah. And so, you know, you can open a certain kind of conversation, give people the vibe, get it in their bones, and then they have that to then tap into with pulses. Whereas if you just try and generate it, it won't land all the way. It kind of, again, it's the neck up problem. So yeah, I think one of the opportunities / challenges for DAOs is, how do you establish those kind of cultural norms and ways of being, and then weave them into the day-to-day work. You know, I think like the whole good morning like phenomenon that's kind of happening or is happening in Web3 is really fascinating. And I have, you know, there's a Telegram group that I'm on with like 200 people, and it's almost just like a GM group. Like, you see all these people checking in with GM, and it's like, it's such a primitive, but it points directly at the sort of needs. You know, it's like, this is what spontaneous culture online looks like. Like, it's grasping toward the same essence. It's just a very rudimentary form of it.
I mean, the best place that I've ever lived, you can tell it's a good place because when you walk down the street, everyone says good morning, right? Like, there's this assumption that the other person's experience is interesting, and you kind of want to have them be like, I wish you a good day, and they wish it back at me. I'm like, oh. Yeah. I think that, like, you know, when you say that this call is the first one to get scratched from a full calendar, that to me is just like, that's just a poor optimization. You know, it's just like, it's just failed to compete. And I'm thinking about like, well, like, why does everyone want to go to Burning Man? You know, it's like, because the vibe there is so good, and they want to go back, and they want to go back, and more people want to come, and it keeps growing because it's like, people love it. I think it's possible to do the same thing. It's just that we're in the early stage of trying to translate. It's like, how do we do things like belonging, things like conviviality, things like socializing in these boxes? You know, it's like, right. If you and I were in the same room right now, we wouldn't be in the room. We'd be walking through the forest because you're in this like amazing place, and I would get to know you in a different way. And we've got this like very limited kind of lame way to meet someone. But I think it's possible to make adaptations. You know, it's like, it doesn't work to have a dinner party on Zoom. Like, don't try and just lift something that used to work in the office and try and reproduce it. It's got to go in a different dimension. And the best that I've found so far is like, well, number one is you create the Burning Man experience. So the congregation is so intensely amazing that people are just like, oh, I need to, at least a couple of times a month, I need to go and get another dose of that stuff,
Go back
whatever
to
it
the
was.
well.
It was so good. And then the other thing that's working in some contexts and not in others is the development stuff. So saying like, any sustainable organization needs to be developing its people. Like they need to have a context where they're being pushed to grow and like get feedback, and to have a context of like accountability and support, all that sort of stuff. That can happen in these pods as well, where it's like you've got practices and a framework to help you identify what are your learning edges, what are your goals, what kind of accountability actually works for you, because probably having someone nag you and like wag their finger is probably not very helpful. And get people to like name the destination and name the kind of support that gets them there. I think, again, with the right structure, that can be a space that people actually value every time. It's not some kind of like, oh, there's some long-term payoff and that we trust each other and that'll be good if we have a conflict. It's like, no, every week I go to that thing and I come away with more energy and more clarity and more enthusiasm than before I went. So of course I'm going to go to it.
Yeah, I mean, that brings to mind, I don't know if you're familiar with the sort of the Sacred Design Lab, Casper, Angie, and Sue. Anyway, they wrote this How We Gather report, several more, but it was, yeah. And so they did a prototype called the Formation Project that was sort of this idea of putting these squads together, of saying like, there's some spiritual seeking that we are engaging in, and we're going to do it collectively. It was very structured with like a skilled facilitator and meeting every week. And so I guess it brings to mind, like, I'm like, well, yeah, that's a way to optimize for that. You know, but then that creates a whole new sort of role in a DAO for like, who is structuring and presiding over these cultural programs, basically. You know, I guess I was saying that the call that gets bumped is the one that is sort of, we all come collectively to check in, but there isn't a real clear, like, what are we driving toward? So yeah, installing like some sort of feedback, some sort of like, here's the change I'm working on. I mean, it's been really interesting. I've seen this spontaneously happened out of the MCon that happened in Denver a few weeks ago, which was an amazing RIRL event. And really, you know, from my experience, it was just all of these DAO enthusiasts getting together and chugging the Kool-Aid together, and finally meeting people that don't glaze over when you start raving about DAOs. They start raving too, and it was just like super high vibe event. Coming out of that, there was a Telegram group that started of folks that are working on, you know, fasting and like how to support each other in these fasting journeys. And then it's kind of ballooned into this whole wellness support group, people checking in saying, oh, I'm having this stressful time, I really want a cigarette, and I don't want to. And it's like, you know, that's something that people are showing up for. Now there's like regular check-in calls that people are showing up for, and this like spontaneously generated. So again, like that points to the need certainly there. And again, a huge opportunity for the DAO that takes that leap and says, this is something that needs to be really thoughtfully structured and resourced to do. And you know, I guess going back to some of the things we talked about at the top of the call, that's where I see is like the leap that DAOs will make, is moving away from this sort of like this idea of trustless collaboration. You know, Trake talks a lot about how, no, we need the trustless layer of the blockchain, but the DAO is actually the trustful layer. And the whole point of having the trustlessness is so that we can have trustfulness built on top of it. I don't need to be mindful of different attack vectors within, you know, the DAO. It's interesting, like building Coordinape, you know, one of the first questions we always have, because people are just self-directed allocating resources, and people always ask, right, it's like, what about collusion? Like, what if people decide they're going to collude together? And that just is like the mindset of like, we have to protect against Sybil attack vectors. But if you look really, there's very little incentive to collude, and there's also very little desire. like with 40 plus protocols using it in the beta, we haven't had any examples really of collusion. Much more there's example of sort of, all of the social stuff again builds in. Oh, they gave me some. Should I give them some? Do I have to give them just because they gave to me? Oh, they gave a lot to that person. It's like all of those things come into play. But the sort of orientation around trustlessness is like, it needs to really be differentiated from the infrastructure where it's, critical to the DAO space where it's actually just serving a function, and actually we want to optimize DAOs for trust.
I saw a story today. Someone, because of a bug, like a combination of a protocol bug plus poor user experience, paid $20 million in gas fees for a transaction.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, a lot. Oh, this is so sad. This, the space is so early. It's so broken. This needs to be fixed. But the line of the story of, well, the $20 million was returned. Like voluntarily, the person who received the money was like, you know what, you have it back because this doesn't seem right. And I'm like,
the miner.
That's the opposite of an attack vector. That's an altruism vector. It's like, well, how are we designing for as many altruism vectors as possible and make that the norm, and yeah, okay, you don't want to be completely naive, but
right.
That's not a one-off story. It's actually quite common.
Yeah. And that's like, what are we, if this is kind of the age-old question for me, it's like, well, if you can design for integrity, then you don't need to design for anything else, right? I can make 100 rules to prevent someone from doing something, or I can just have people innately know what they should and shouldn't be doing. That's kind of the age-old question, but it's like, how can we develop more and more like rewards for acting in integrity? And I also, I think that if you zoom out and in the big picture, I think one of the reasons that there's so much energy and that there will be so much energy in DAOs is that a lot of folks, in our generation and below have sort of grown up with kind of every institution failing. When you look at government or education or healthcare or criminal justice, right? They're all like hopelessly broken. they're so complexly broken that it's just like there is no way to sort of reform them or change them from the inside. It's just like, shit, we're so far ahead, in our capacities of where these institutions are capable of facilitating us to go, that we just need to scrap it. And Web3 is sort of, it offers this potential, and obviously like naively to some degree. I'm okay with being naively optimistic, but it's like, well, we can separate money from state. Like I think for the first time we have the opportunity to, like Buckminster Fuller said, like, don't fight the old system, just like make a new one and make the old one obsolete. And this is different than a lot of other things I've been a part of, especially in the sustainability movement. It was still always oriented around like fighting the thing before, the evil corporations, we have to fight against this. And this is just, hey, we're going to throw a better party. And it's more fun over here, and we don't have to convince anyone of anything. Just come over here. And that is where I think a lot of this energy from Web3 is coming from, is like, it finally feels like we can do something about all of these insurmountable, challenges and institutions that we have to go through to make some sort of change. Like, no, we can build our own.
Yeah, I love the better party, and I feel like I've been living in the better party for like 10 years, and I have a little sense of responsibility of like, it's more fun to party with more people, it's like it's totally. good to recruit. Yeah. And so there's always this puzzle of like the stuff that we're talking about is so bleeding edge, it's not accessible to your average person. Right. And so it's like, how much responsibility should I take for that, of like trying to create accessible pathways? It's like, to a certain degree, yes, but I can't take responsibility for everyone in the world, right? Like, I'm not going to put on that big savior complex either. So it's like a balancing act, I guess.
Yeah, and it's always, it's a balancing act, and it's just accepting there's like, I for myself, I'm always kind of living in this really uncomfortable tension between the obvious future I see as possible, you know, kind of the Eisenstein, the more beautiful world my heart knows is possible, is very clear and obvious. And then just the steps to get there are always much harder and slower than they seem like they should be. It feels like we kind of have all the tools and all the tech and all the consciousness ready to just like build the regenerative, you know, global system, but it's right here. But it's taken longer than I think it should. But yeah, like living in the better party, and then how do we make sure that better party doesn't require the same, you know, all the forms of privilege that we enjoy in order to join in on it, is a big question. Because it's like, you know, crypto is a really white male party right now. I don't think that's a secret, and we certainly want to change that as quickly and as much as possible.
I mean, that's on that earlier question I brought before about like templates for culture. I think the test is, like, I don't feel confident to make any claims about the cultural design patterns that we're producing until I see them getting picked up and localized into very different cultural contexts. And it's like, at that point, then I have some confidence. So I'm not evaluating it based on what's the demographic makeup of the crypto scene, or what's the demographic makeup of like my events or my communities, but at a more abstract layer than that, like, do these cultural patterns show up in really significantly different situations, and can they adapt into their local context and grow, you know, like any species would do. So that's the big unknown at this stage.
Yeah, I think one of the key metrics of success is remixability. You know, if you see something getting adopted and remixed continuously, then you know you're onto something for sure. That's an important point. What's underneath the demographics? What's the pattern that's common across all of these difference?
I'm looking at the clock because I'm fiendishly committed to punctuality.
That is a trait of a good facilitator, I must say.
Yeah. I try and use it for good, not always for evil. I really do appreciate your time. I'm really glad to have met you, and I hope we get to keep connecting in the future.
Oh, we absolutely will. I think there's lots of conversations that I have been keen to loop you into around all this IRL stuff, and I think that a lot of the frameworks you're developing at the Hum have a real opportunity to add value to what we're trying to build here in this crazy new DAO world.
Zach, I feel seen.
Great.
You got me.
Great. I've been waiting for the chance to see you. So I'm glad I finally got it. I've been seeing you from afar for a while and appreciating the work you've been laying down. So great to see you in real time.
Yeah, I'm really glad that I now have the availability to like be looking back and be like, hey, who else is out there? What are they doing? Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it too.
Press stop.
All right.